Coming up on this episode of the IoT Inc Business Show.
When a company sponsors a testbed, they may say, this is commercially sensitive information. It's not something that we wish to share with everybody, and so we're not going to. But more generally, what happens is pretty much everything comes out because they recognize the value of saying, this is what we have, and this is what we learned, and now we all of us in the entire ecosystem need to take advantage of that to get us to the next level.
No one company is big enough to provide an end-to-end Industrial Internet of Things solution. Realizing this, the Industrial Internet Consortium, or IIC, was founded to bring together different solutions from different vendors to address different use cases. The end game, however, is not technology but business, to understand what is needed to put together solutions that not only work well, but sell well. I'm a big believer in ecosystems, so in this episode of the IoT Business Show, I speak with Stephen Mellor about the IIC to see if this consortium is right for you.
All this and more on this episode of the IoT Inc Business Show. The people, the business, and the technology of the next generation internet. This is the IoT Inc Business Show. And now, here's your host, Bruce Sinclair.
Hello and welcome to the IoT Inc Business Show. This show is for business leaders and managers employing the Internet of Things for their business or the business of their customers. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair, and I interview the industry's leading authorities to find out how they use IoT to improve business and create value. If you like this show, subscribe to it on iTunes and go to IoTinc.com to check out my complimentary articles, videos, meetups, and webinars.
First, a little housekeeping. This is the first episode of 3 on IoT consortia, alliances, and groups. This is the second time I've had the IIC on the show. 99 episodes ago, I thought there were 5 main IoT ecosystems that could be right for you. Now it's down to 3, and I interview them all. The IIC, the Open Connectivity Foundation, or OCF, and the Industry 4.0 group. This episode is made possible by the IoT Inc Certified IoT Professional, or ICIP or ISIP, online training and certification program. Become a certified IoT professional by taking the program's 3 courses: ICIP Technology, ICIP Business, and ICIP Strategy and Digital Transformation. Details of which can be found at www.iot-inc.com/training. This week's ICIP graduate shout-out is to a few people: Louis Niazi, Brian Bunce, Chris Herbert, Damien Trujillo, Asok Bhaskar, and Emmanuel Makira. I'm sure I'm butchering probably at least 4 out of those 6 names. If you're looking for an IoT boss for your organization, you can get to their LinkedIn profiles from the front page of www.iot-inc.com. With me today on the IoT show is Stephen Mellor. Stephen is the CTO for the Industrial Internet Consortium, where he directs standards requirements and technology and security priorities for the industrial internet. In that role, he coordinates activities of several testbed working groups and teams. This is the second time I've had the IIC on the show, and Stephen was one of the guests for that episode a few years back. But a lot has changed, so I'm doing another series on consortia, alliances, and groups for the Internet of Things. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's been a couple of years, but I wanted to start with test beds. Now, I've always thought the test beds was one of the strongest things about the IIC. Why don't you describe what they are and how they're used?
Sure. A testbed is a scaled down but real world system that allows us to check out new technology, old technology in new ways, different forms of business model, and so on and so forth. The notion is that each testbed should make a contribution to the economy or society, and that's at the very high level, of course. And then at the more, if you like, mundane level, to provide us with some insights in the kinds of things that we can do with these systems that we didn't know about. So in one sense, they're experiments. They are more than proof of concept. They are intended to be deployed. So in that case, I kind of retract a little bit from or reside a little bit from the experiment idea. But the notion here is to get something running and learn. And the reason that we do that is because this is an entirely new area. This connection of the control systems to through the internet to big data analytics and so on and so forth is something that we don't know where it's going to take us. The way in which I conceive of this is that we are kind of where Sir Tim Berners-Lee was 35 years ago. This is an interesting idea. Let's do this and see what happens. And he addressed his particular problem, which is simply sharing documents in a lab. But now look what we can do with it. I'm talking to you using voice over IP. It uses all of this kind of technology. None of that would have been possible or even imagined 35 years ago.
Yeah, one of the things one of the things about the Internet of Things, like you already stated a few different parts of it, but there's so many variables involved that there isn't a one fits all. And bringing together the different companies, and I've been to a couple IIC meetings, and I've seen how they kind of operate, at least at a very high level. But maybe you can talk to us just to describe like how many companies are involved, how is the project started, is it generally done for a customer? Because I think this is important because, again, it's flushing out all the each of the point products, let's call them products or services, they can be well defined, but it's when you connect them all together is when entropy sort of gets involved. So maybe give us a little bit more detail.
Sure. There's two questions hiding in what you just said. One of them is more about the consortium and the other about testbeds. So what I'll do is I'll describe the consortium briefly in this context, and then I'll head down into testbeds. If we can go back later to more about the consortium as we need to. The way in which the consortium operates is that we were founded 4 years ago and a little bit now. We're all nearly 5 years old. Time to go to school. By 5 global companies that realized that they couldn't do everything. And this relates very specifically to what you just asked, namely, how do I get something going? How do I bring all these parts together? And because they realized that you couldn't do everything, they also came to the conclusion that we could gain more by collaborating to build the market than we could by competing directly, if you like, at the edge of the shore. This is a so-called blue ocean market. We don't know where it is. The key thing here is to grow it. So that's the initial way of thinking about it. And to do that, clearly you need to construct an ecosystem and to get things going. So from that, I want to go now to there's a lot more to say there, of course, but I want to go now to the specific thing about a test bed. Let's say that a member company has an interesting idea for a test bed. Mm-hmm. What they're likely to do is to cogitate on this, talk to some of their existing partners, try to work out, define in more detail. I mean, these things kind of start as PowerPoint and then they get more specific as time goes on. And then you begin to say, okay, I think we might be able to do this. And then those companies, and I will call them sponsors, they would come to the IIC or be working already within the IIC or have met their partner in the IIC, whatever it is. And they would say, well, here's the testbed idea that we have. What do you all think? And then other people within the consortium review the proposal at the testbed working group meeting. It doesn't really matter what the names of these groups are, but basically these are people interested in testbeds, and they ask questions, and they wonder how their technology fits in. And typically then what this will lead to is a growing of the sponsors from the 2 or 3 people that started it to 5 or 6. And those sponsors then have a clearer idea about what it is that they're building, why they're building it, what they're building it for, and why it is that they think it's going to be valuable to their companies. Now, at this point, there's 2 ways to go. One way is to understand ownership. The first thing here is to understand that the IIC does not own any of this. Mm-hmm. What we do is we facilitate getting people together to make this happen. This is all ecosystem related, right? So the sponsors then own that testbed, they fund that testbed, they build that testbed, they have the results from that testbed, and they divide up the pieces that they need as necessary. Someone might offer some software that does this, someone might offer a site, someone might offer something, and between them, those parties decide what direct benefits they gain from that. Now, obviously, what the IIC wants to see here is a set of insights into how these things work. And there's value in doing that, right, for these companies, because they can then say, this is an IIC branded testbed. This is the kind of thing that we learned here. And they can then make that public through the IIC or directly or whatever it is. And then we can use those insights also to go to standards development bodies and say things like, well, we have this testbed over here. It's figured out that what you really need to have is some standard way of describing devices on a factory floor. If we could have that, then we would be able to interoperate between the different vendors. We'd be able to control them all instead of just controlling ours or theirs, as the case may be. And here are our requirements. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And from that, of course, you can get the standard, which is not anything that the IIC does, and that in turn grows the market. So you can see here that what's going on is that what we're doing is that we are facilitating member companies constructing these test beds so that they can learn and so that they can grow the market, and then that feeds into itself all over again. So that's kind of the ownership side. The other side of it is that we run the test bed through a series of, I'll call them tests for the moment, just for chuckles, because then we can test the test bed. The idea here is, for example, what are you doing about security? Well, I'm not doing anything about security. I'm just trying to see how many bits I can push down this pipe. Okay, well, that's interesting. It doesn't sound very of huge economic benefit, but I can understand why we need that. But what are you doing about security? Well, nothing. Okay, well, hang on. When you use this pipe, you're going to have some security on it. You can't have it completely open. So that's going to slow it down. So what really are you learning? And then you go through this cycle. And so the security folk, they have a set of questions that they ask that are put to the test bed. And they can answer them any way they like. It's not a gate. But it encourages them to think through the implications of security on their particular testbed. Because in the end, our goal is to build a trustworthy industrial internet. Mm-hmm. These things control physical devices. We can't have a situation where they are insecure or untrustworthy or hurt people. So what we have to do is to ensure that security is embedded in everything that we do. So we start that with test beds. And then the other groups also have their say. We are interested, for example, in understanding this particular use of analytics that you have proposed. But if you looked at it this way, would that help you? And we would be really happy to learn more about that over time. So these things all feed together so that we can build up a set of information that we can then use to feed that feedback loop.
So we got the ownership, which is the production of the test bed. That makes sense. And then you're saying you're kind of testing the test beds. You mentioned security. You mentioned analytics. Mm-hmm. Are there any other groups, as you mentioned, or that you described them, that are kind of involved in doing this testing, or the testing on the test beds?
Yes.
Probing, I should say.
The way it is at the moment is that we only do security. But what we are discovering as we proceed is that we need to link it up with everything. And I mentioned analytics because they've had an interest. Mm-hmm. That's not formalized at the moment, but we are in the process of formalizing it for each of the different frameworks that we have published. So that includes the Industrial Internet Reference Architecture. It includes the security framework, obviously, which I mentioned. It includes the connectivity framework. It also includes the business strategy and innovation framework. And what we're doing is piece by piece trying to understand what it is that we need to know so that we can ask the right questions. Because this is a very dynamic environment, which I kind of gave you the idea of right at the very beginning. We, first of all, had to construct some of these frameworks, particularly the IIRA, the Industrial Internet Reference Architecture, and the corresponding security framework, mm-hmm. so that we had a common vocabulary amongst ourselves. Right now, we have two questions, which is, what's missing? What's wrong? How is it that this actually affects what I do? So that it's more of a learning process, and that's why we want to connect that to the test bed. And the other part of it is to make it more actionable so that we can say, okay, well, you don't want to read 170 pages of the Industrial Internet Security Framework. You're busy. What you really care about is endpoint protection best practices. How can we most quickly get you to that, get you to the information that you need to solve that problem? How can we most quickly give you the information that you need to build these systems more rapidly and more reliably?
And where I was going with this, and you kind of touched on it, but the business side of things. So there's the technology, obviously, and we need to get that all working together well. And there's lessons to be learned there. Mm-hmm. But I guess in some cases, if I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, sometimes there is an end customer, sometimes there isn't. But is there discussion? And you kind of briefly mentioned ecosystems, which I do want to talk about later. But is there a discussion on what would be the business model? Because when you do bring in, you're saying 6, 7, 8 companies together, some of them big, some of them small, they're going to have to share in the revenue in some way. And this is generally going to be the function of the ecosystem. So are the business models discussed? Are they tested? Is this part of the process, or is this still something that's sort of being worked toward?
Yes and no is the short answer, which is lovely weaselly answer, as you might expect. The business strategy and innovation framework definitely outlines the issues that you need to be looking at. People are queried about that. A lot of the test bed proposals that people write, because this has to go through a series of steps within the organization to be approved as an IoT test bed, focus on economic and societal value. They focus a bit less on business model. But obviously, the sponsors of the test bed have to sort that out amongst themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that we need to be able to learn and need to be able to understand. So that is definitely a part of the overall structure. What we are in the process of trying to do right now is to get a better handle on how we can help people work their way through finding appropriate answers. So, for example, we have one group working on monetization. We have another group that's looking at building up a library of use cases that are involved in this area as opposed to purely technical ones. We have a whole series of people that are looking at these different areas in different ways. We're particularly keen on thinking about the sophistication that you need to be able to build your system. And that applies in security. There's no point having high-level bank vault security for a garbage bag But your company needs to be sophisticated enough to recognize that, and also to recognize there's a gold ingot hidden in the bottom of the garbage. And then that applies also in terms of the business models and how it is that you think about what you need to be able to do to make money out of this, because that's a real question. People are gathering enormous amounts of data, but we don't really know what to do with it.
Yeah, and analytics, and I would probably, step up one level and go data science, which would consist of the analytics and the AI being, very important components for, and that is directly related to the monetization.
Yes,
but to go back,
understand. Sorry to interrupt you, but do understand there's a gap here between the data, the information that you might get from analytics, and then how actually you make money out of it.
Yeah, and
right?
and
getting the data and analyzing it to produce information. Well, what information do you need? Once you can understand that, you're kind of halfway there. But you still have to do the other half, which is, okay, I got this information. Where's the cash?
Right. And kind of the way I describe it is, what's the value you're trying to create? What's the information you need to produce to create that value? Then what's the data you need to transform into that information to produce that value? And then we can get to the technology. But that discussion, generally, it makes a lot of sense to have it up front. And because it does, to a certain extent, for an IoT or IoT product, data science should be pretty fundamental. It should be pretty much driving most of what you're doing technically, because that is what's creating the value.
I certainly agree with that. And having grown up as a real-time and embedded systems developer way back when, here's a chemical plant, make it work, that kind of thing. You certainly do begin with what's the value, how do I then, all the way down to the technology. But let's understand also that there is another way of thinking about this, which is to go bottom up instead of the top down thing that you described. Namely, I've got this data. Is there a way I can make some money out of it? If I look at this data and I interpret it in this way, what does it tell me? Does it tell me something interesting? Does it tell me something valuable? And so when you hear people talking about mashups and all that kind of thing, where they, gather components together and then see what happens, that also needs to be thought about. It's not just one way. And then if I may carry on to a separate point here, that relates also to the relationship between information technology and operational technology. Again, the typical thing used to be, I've got this problem, chemical plant I used as my example. Okay, now what is the information technology I need to control that? Well, now it's also I'm not making it a converse. I'm saying in addition, we also have, we've got all this IT and it's got all this information about how the chemical plant works. What else can we learn?
Yeah. And to go back to your point, I think to a certain extent is romanticized, or is a romantic notion that you're going to be able to extract a lot of value out of this data exhaust. But I do see value. I mean, I see that, and artificial intelligence is somewhere in specifically when unstructured data and unlearned data. You can probably use it to a certain extent, but my experience has definitely been, you want to plan this from the very beginning, and if there's any let's say additional value that you can extract from that data exhaust that you've planned from the beginning, you didn't just randomly produce, gather this data, then that's great. And I want to go back to value a little bit here, in the sense of I see a lot of value, and that's how I started things out in these test beds. Now, what about members that are not part of the test beds? You did mention the insights that are gathered from them and the lessons learned. I suppose it's just on a case-by-case basis that sometimes there are. How is that information, or is that information disseminated to other members that are maybe not in or part of the test bed?
It can be. We would not encourage it for very obvious reasons. We wouldn't be able to do the work that we do if everybody did what they wanted for free, if you like. But let's just take an example. Let's say that you have a university that has a particular set of skills and interests they're not going to pay to be a member of the consortium. That's just not their core function. But what they can offer is some knowledge, some labor, is the good old using the master's students again, right? And they then can get value from that. So we have a kind of tiered marketing program. So we might mention that University X was involved in this testbed, but we're not going to stick them on the front page.
Sure.
We're going to stick the sponsors on the front page. So
and I was talking
we're
more
actually trying
about
to formalize
members,
that
though.
at the moment. It's kind of okay, but it's not very formal at the moment.
But I was talking about more, not the general public in general, but more the members, whatever level, and we'll talk about the different levels in a little while, but just the members themselves. Do they have any, any access to the insights, or is it really the people that put in the work and put in the money within those working groups?
All members have all access to everything, and I'll qualify the everything in just a second.
Okay.
And I also need to clarify the meaning of member. Within the IIC, a member is a company, and the individual is the member representative. And if you join as a member company, then every person in your company can attend IIC stuff and get access to the information and so on and so forth. So now I'm going to qualify the everything. When a company sponsors a testbed, they may say to themselves, either right at the beginning or a little bit later on, this is commercially sensitive information. It's not something that we wish to share with everybody, and so we're not going to. And then the members wouldn't see it. But more generally, what happens is pretty much everything comes out because they recognize the value of saying, this is what we have, and this is what we learned, and now we all of us in the entire ecosystem, the global ecosystem, not just IIC, need to take advantage of that to get us to the next level. Now, I can make that concrete. In the US, as you know, if you have government money, you are required, therefore, to publish your information in a way that makes that public to the people who paid for it, namely the taxpayer. So if you were having a test bed and you wanted to get some arm of government to sponsor some of that, you wouldn't want, therefore, to expose your entire intellectual property to the world. So what you do is you segment the test bed to say, well, you funded this and this is the information that you get, but that's my software and I know how it works and I'm not letting you see it. Right. So there are ways to do that, but so that's the, if you like, the framework. So far, to the best of my knowledge, everything has been published, and it's published first of all to members, and we're also working to take it to the larger group, to the world. What we're doing here really is bringing the information along. Initially, the sponsors know it, and they can act on it. Later, the members know it and can act on it. Later, our liaisons know about it and can act on it. Later, the world knows about it. And obviously, the sooner you know, the better off you are.
Right. No, that seems practical, and I like it. I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, I've been focusing on these test beds because I think they're very powerful, but maybe describe a little bit more about the Industrial Internet Consortium. It does obviously more than just test beds. I think that's critical, though, but maybe give us a little bit bigger or wider picture.
Sure. I'd like to go back to to my initial statement about the consortium, namely founded 4 years ago, 5 global companies, etc. We're now about 220 companies. It goes up and down, and that's okay. People come in. I think the single, and I haven't done a detailed study on this, but just by talking to people, I'd say the single key reason why people don't stay is that they don't have the time to engage, and you have to engage. There's no point in turning up, listening to a couple of presentations and going away. It's just, that's not helpful. So the numbers do go up and they do go down, and that's fine. We meet physically 4 times a year. Our next meeting is in Good Grief. Where is it? Yes, it's in Chicago. And the one following is in Beijing. And we try to maintain a pattern of 2 North America, 1 Europe, 1 Asia, or there are other continents, I'm sure you're aware, but we're unlikely to meet in Antarctica, but there you go. So that allows us then to get that ecosystem really going strongly. We have a number of groups, and I won't bore you with the administrative details about these different groups, but basically they are centered around technology, security, business, marketing, and I've missed one, liaisons, and of course the test beds. So each one of those groups kind of runs its own little area, and they have very different ways of working. The technology group obviously is kind of divided out into subgroups that deal with each of the different technologies. The marketing people are more focused on making connections to end users and the businesses that they are working in. So there's all sorts of different kinds of things going on there. And those folk meet some cases weekly. Actually, I was just on a call before I talked to you. They're meeting twice a week. Some people meet every couple of weeks, and so on and so forth. So you'll often find these calls with 5 to 50 people on them discussing a particular thing of interest. And then what we have been doing, and I want to emphasize the past tense there, is producing documents, these framework documents that I mentioned, such as the reference architecture and the security framework. And then later, more recently, we've been working on best practices in endpoint protection. We're working now on best practices in communications. But what we're trying to do now that we have the kind of the walls, the framework, if you want, is to find better ways of linking these things together so that people can quickly say, here's my problem. What do I need to know to address it? And what kind of technologies can I use? So we're working on that kind of thing at the moment. And everybody is working in different ways at different levels to get different things done. As a member-driven organization, it's really up to what the members want. And what they want is to be able to accelerate development of IoT projects within their business.
Yeah, and I think you early on you brought up a very good point for everyone listening right now is if you do, and I do recommend for as much on the ecosystem side, which we're going to talk about as the technology side, but I do recommend finding the right consortium, alliance, group, whatever it is for you. But you have to be able to engage, like Stephen said. Attending these meetings once a year, maybe you get the access to that information, like you were saying, Stephen, a little bit earlier than the general public. But you have to be able to really engage. And what would you say then? Someone saying, "All right, well, do I need to put someone full time, half time?" What would you say, Stephen, would be the right amount of engagement for a reasonable ROI on joining?
Well, you'll be amazed, I'm sure, to know that my answer is how long is a piece of string. It really depends on what it is that you're trying to achieve. We have a number of companies that are 2-person companies, and they're very active. And they do a lot of work, and they are very connected to all of the stuff, and they are very well positioned in the global marketplace to express what they're doing and why. We have, of course, large global companies, and they in turn have multiple divisions, each of which is doing their own thing. And sometimes they don't talk to each other. I actually went to visit one of our founder members in a different continent altogether, and the fellow asked me, "What's IIC?" And I thought, wait, surely your company knows about this. Well, no, as it turned out, they didn't. So you have to try to find the different areas within your company that have a stake in trying to learn more and to make more in this context. We work hard to find people who can lead. And that kind of leadership often is something which is both of personal interest as well as corporate interest. The ding dong that you just heard from my phone, and I do apologize from that, is from somebody who is taking 5 weeks off. Yeah, right. He'll be on the call on Thursday. I know he will. He always is. So there's a lot of personal investment as well as corporate investment. The goal here, of course, is to get these things all aligned, right? How is it that your company's particular interest in, let's say, zero-day security can benefit from understanding the other things that you need to be able to do in security? Well, I know the answer to that. I'm not a security guy. But nevertheless, and it seems to me that any company who has any technology is interested in how it relates to all the other ones. And they want to be able to fit them together and find partners to build real projects. To forget test beds, build real projects. Find partners, make things happen, bring their technology forward, and ensure that the world as a whole is using the same kind of vocabulary and the same way of thinking about how your technology fits in. So how long is a piece of string?
Yeah, so let's talk about the length of that string again, because if someone is deciding to join the IIC, for example, they're going to look at it. Well, what's my investment? The investment's going to be both in terms of the fees, and which we'll talk about, and then the time, and then what do I get out of it? And I think we're getting a pretty good sense of what we're going to get out of it. But would you say, then let me just throw something out for you. If someone was to dedicate half time of someone, are they going to be happy? Is that going to be something? Because I know obviously the larger companies, they actually have people on staff, and that's what they do. I mean, they're full time. That's what they do. But smaller companies, I'm thinking, let's look at the SMEs where a majority of where the innovation is coming from. I can see a lot of value for them being part of it because they get to rub shoulders with these larger companies. But at the same time, the CEO, the VP, the manager, whoever's deciding has to say, well, we're going to have to dedicate John 25% of his time. Half. Would that be, I'm just guessing, but is that just to give people, I don't know, squint your eyes and just in general and average and all the rest of it. But is that a reasonable time request?
Well, that 10% is the length of a particular piece of string, yes. It really does vary. Again, we have small companies who are deeply involved, and they're investing probably 25% of their time of a person out of their relatively small corporate structure. And we have larger companies where they have people dedicated 100% of the time, but to more than just this consortium, also to standards development bodies, to other consortia, and so on and so forth. And their job essentially is to be a channel for this information, to gather information and take it to the company, and note areas of risk or areas of potential benefit.
Okay. No, that gives us something to work with, because I think if I decipher what you said, then you're saying, you should probably be looking at around a fifth, maybe 20%. That's probably, the table stakes to really get something. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but to really get something out of it. From what it sounds like, that's around there, around 20% of person. That's less than I expected, actually. So I'm kind of happy with hearing about that.
Well, what you'll find also is that it varies not just by company, but and by individual, but also by the overall thrust of the work. We have over 4,000 people on the various rosters. Out of the 200 plus companies, 4,000 plus people. Those people have access to the written information. So that means that if they dip in once a year to say what the heck is going on in this particular area, they still got some value. But how are we going to count that, right? It's the people who do the work. And I know those 100 people that are doing the work.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Well, let's switch gears a little bit, and it's going to be related again to this decision of joining. But there is you've described a pretty cross matrix-like organization within the IIC. This has to be financed. So how do you cover your costs? And is it strictly through membership fees, or give us a little bit of description of how you how you pay for all this?
Sure. We have an annual subscription fee, which depends on the revenue of your company. It's $50K for a company that's earning more than 50 million and $5K for one that is smaller than that number. We're actually looking at alternative pricing models, because if you're earning $50,000,001, suddenly it doesn't look so good. But roughly speaking, that's what's going on. What that gets you, of course, is access to everything that we provide: the mailing list, the servers, the documents, the this, the that, the other, and also, depending on the size of company, a certain number of people can attend our face-to-face meetings. So, as I told you before, we run 4 at the moment face-to-face meetings in a year. Those 4 meetings obviously cost money, right? You've got to get the hotel, and you've got to get the this, and you've got to get the that. As I said, if you are a large company, then a certain number of people can go for free. If you're going to send a contingent of 100 people, then clearly we would ask you to pay some extra to cover the costs of that, because we run receptions and dinners and learn as well, because it's all ecosystem, right? But our goal in all of these things is, apart from the subscription fee, that these should be flat, right? The goal is not to make a profit out of the meeting. Right. The goal is not to make a loss.
Okay.
And over time it goes up and it goes down, and so it's coming from the subscriptions.
So subscriptions, and then like you said, if after a certain number of people for attending these 4 live meetings, and that makes total sense, because again, everyone listening here is saying, okay, is it right for me? Now I know there's a little bit. You mentioned the 5K for, which I think is a great deal. For companies that are less than 50 million. 50K for larger than 50 million. Now you've got something a little bit above and a little bit below as well. Can you describe what is the contributing member and
sure.
what's below the 5K?
We have 6 levels of membership. There are founders. And when the founders began the consortium, their goal was to kickstart this. They had a fairly large chunk of change to get things going, because obviously you got to do a lot of work, and there's no how else you going to do it. So they put in they contributed a large sum, and they are founders, and that's
capped, right? There's no more founders.
Sorry.
There's no more new founders, right?
No.
Right?
No.
Okay.
You are a founder, and then there's no more.
Right.
But there are other companies who joined later who are interested in contributing also at this high level.
Right.
And they are called contributing members. And you can apply to be a contributing member. We have limits on how many seats there are and all that kind of stuff. And you have to be elected by our existing steering committee, which is a group of folk, a dozen people, who direct the overall direction. They make the strategic decisions, right? So next year, this meeting, whatever, we're going to be looking at intelligent transportation systems, or what do we need to do in manufacturing, that kind of thing. That they make those decisions. So you can become a contributing member if you're willing to pay more, be on the steering committee, get elected, etc., etc. And then we have a number of representatives from large industry. I forget the exact numbers. Small industry, academic or non-profit. And then finally, any government agency can join up for 12.5, which is not a lot for a government. I really think we ought to charge them more, personally. I want more of my taxpayer dollars, please.
Okay, no, and I think the academic and nonprofit, that's very nominal at 2.5K, and then contributing at 150K, which makes a lot of sense. And if you were to just give us a rough distribution, what is obviously the founders would be I don't know if it's obvious, but they'd be the least the number. But are we looking mostly at large industry, small industry? What's
most in what context?
Just in terms of membership, overall membership, I suppose.
I don't have that data in front of me, but I would say that we have a large number of small industries, in over 40%. Many of those are based in the US. And that comes about primarily, I think, because of cost and so on. If you're in Japan and you want to go to, Europe and the US, that's 3 trips a year. That's expensive, and you're a small company, et cetera, et cetera. So we do have a lot of small companies, and I think that is, as you said, it's a good deal. And it gives you access to these larger companies who might be very interested in your technology. And then with that, you can move on. In the larger companies, we are spread across the globe. We have a large number of companies that are headquartered in Japan, a large number that are headquartered in China, a large number, of course, in Europe. I was just actually reading something the other day about the number of 18 companies based in Japan. That's where the headquarters is, which is quite a lot. I mean, that's 10%,
that's almost 10%.
20%. And the China number is about the same, and so it goes. But they do tend, unfortunately, to be more global. And that's one reason why we're setting up regional teams in the various areas. Our oldest and first is in Germany. And here we're working with a member that is a well-established research organization, so they can stand up and say, well, we don't have any commercial interest in how this works. We just want to see it work, right? And so what they do then is they hold meetings in German, a language that I can only speak a few words, like ein Bier bitte, etc.
I'm with you.
And they can hold it in German, and they can also hold it when I'm fast asleep in the US. So that's one. We have another one in India. I was there in May, set up quite recently. China and Japan are in the works, and a number of others, so that we can get more smaller companies involved in the larger entity.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, and like I observed, the smaller companies get a lot of benefit, if nothing else, with the contacts that they make. And I think that's a good transition into, let's talk now about business and the business advantages of joining. So if I would just ask you an open-ended question, what are the business advantages of joining the IIC? What would you say?
Ecosystem is where I'd start.
Yeah.
It's because that really is the pointy end. You started by asking about test beds, and we are known, I think, for being among the first people to bring out this idea and use it in a way that we could use it in a way that delivered value. But behind that is the ecosystem. So why do you want access to the ecosystem? Well, you want to find partners. You want to learn from what people are doing or what they're concerned about, because they may be concerned about something that you hadn't thought about, and you'd like to know about that. You want to be able to bring that knowledge back to your corporation. You want to get some marketing advantages, because obviously when you sponsor a test bed, we're going to market that. We're going to say, here's something that's getting done. This is exciting. The world needs to know about that. And by the way, here are the sponsors. Just imagine that you're looking at one of our pages, and you can go to iiconsortium.org and look up the test bed page, and you'll see for each of the test beds the companies that are involved. And if you see IBM, Fujitsu, and ThingsWise, what's going to happen? You're going to, so I know IBM is, who the heck is ThingsWise?
Right.
What do they offer? So you get benefit from that as well. And then, of course, as you really get more involved in test beds, you have better access to the technology. You get to shape the vocabulary that the market is using. I mean, I could go on forever.
Yeah. No, and I agree. And I think the ecosystem, bringing together those producers and then also the consumers. And I think, when some of these test beds, and we didn't really nail it completely down, but some of them are actually for commercial purposes as well.
Of course.
So making connections with end customers. And what I find in my work, when I work with the smaller organizations, they generally, if the bigger organizations can't do it all themselves, just like the founding members, which everyone agrees with, just think about the smaller organizations. And so they really need to have a place to start, these relationships. And often ecosystem can just be a business development relationship initially, and then it can evolve into something more fruitful for the companies themselves. And,
exactly.
And so just having these contacts, and again, so just trying to, figure out the whole purpose at a very high level of why we're talking is just understanding the return on investment. So we've talked about the investment part of it. That's going to be the fees. That's going to be the travel costs, accommodation, T&A costs, and that's going to be the time for the person. But then what you get in return, we've talked extensively about the test beds. So technical prowess, but then where I really think, I think it's both, but where I really think a lot of the value, again, is just developing these relationships, because a small company, just like you said, they can be really put on the map in a lot of different ways. Anything else you'd add to that?
No, I think I recall when we were talking about this, that the purpose here was to educate, not to sell, but I do thank you for doing the second part.
Yeah. And again, it's, excuse me, it's really, is the value. I mean, I think everyone listening has to decide, is this for them? And the best way to give them, to have them make that intelligent decision, is give them the data on, again, the cost and the return. But can you maybe also, who's the best profile to join? Now, the name of the organization is the Industrial Internet Consortium. So I'm assuming, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm assuming then a consumer doorbell company may not be the right fit. But if you were to squint your eyes, what's the right fit, for our listeners listening? Who's the right type of company, member company, to join the IIC?
Well, it is, as you say, industrial companies. GE is one of the founders, and they had in 2012 a paper written by a couple of economists, Evans and Annunziata, who did a top-down analysis of how much of the world economy could be affected by the industrial internet, whatever affected means. And then they also did a bottom-up analysis saying, well, for GE's lines of business, what happens if we get a 1% improvement in efficiency and productivity? I'm sure you're aware of that one. Yeah. The key thing here is to try to understand across your factory, chemical plant, whatever it is, across your particular business, how you can derive value by getting information. So what we are looking at is not trying to build a fixed taxonomy of what it means to be industrial, but rather to understand what are the business drivers that are different from a consumer-oriented company. So using doorbell as the example, if the doorbell goes wrong, what's the worst that can happen? Not a whole lot, right. Let's be honest. Right. What happens if your chemical plant gets hacked and puts a whole lot of stuff into the river? That's not so good, right? So what you're looking for here is to observe that the technical drivers are very much the same. Ubiquitous connectivity, cheap computing, big data, blah, blah, blah. But the business drivers are different. For consumer stuff, what you're interested in is low price. For business, you're more interested in return on investment. For the consumer world, of course, you want security. Everybody does. But if you are thinking about security in my chemical plant, that's a wholly different order of thing. If you're thinking about my doorbell loses connectivity to my phone, what's the downside? If, on the other hand, every connected vehicle on I-10 suddenly decides that they don't have connection, what's going to happen? I mean, these are just very, very different. So our focus, when we say industrial, is how is it that these requirements change, and how is it that we can understand what they are so that we can get the kinds of standards, et cetera, that we need to make this happen. So that's a kind of abstract description. I'd like to make it concrete. Think about retail. Retail has obviously a point of sale system connected to the internet, all very exciting. Now, what happens if, for example, You put up some cameras and you watch how people move through the store and do some analytics on the video. But you're beginning to change your problem. What happens if, as you make a sale, you realize with some kind of enterprise requirements planning system that you need to make another order of 100 of these T-shirts? What happens then if you connect that through your supply chain to China and you have a distributed logistics system? You can see where I'm going with this, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff, and suddenly your requirement for just keeping the line between the point of sale and the bank, it's changed its nature. It's qualitatively different. So at that point, I would say retail is an industrial area. Sorry, you're still out of luck.
So this is where I think it's important to clarify, and this is kind of why I asked the question, because I think the purists, and I'll include myself in that camp, will define industrial internet being those industries or those markets that are producing something. So whether that's discrete manufacturing, process manufacturing, agriculture, pulling something out of the earth, they're producing something. But I think you're kind of describing more B2B as opposed to industrial, because you're including commercial, what I call commercial IoT, which is where retail would go in, infrastructure IoT, which is where smart cities, and you mentioned that earlier. So is it really more of a B2B? And by the way, I think the business problems are different, but I think another way to classify it is the risk profiles are very different.
I'd steer away from the B2B stuff. Simply because the classification isn't helpful. I don't think it's wrong. I just don't think it helps. I think the risk profile is a very important characteristic. I think that the business model profile is different. I mentioned low cost versus ROI. It's those kinds of, I call them industrial strength requirements that are different. And of course, I don't have a precise definition of that because we honestly don't know, right? We're still working the problem. So I would think of it mostly in terms of what happens when you scale these things up through the global supply chain, through the technology stack, through et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The thing qualitatively changes.
Okay. But again, for everyone listening, it's more than just, let's say, the specific definition of industrial internet. You're going beyond that. Yeah. And it's maybe not B2B, and I can go with you on that one. But maybe a risk profile, or maybe, maybe that's,
there's nothing at all to stop me from sitting here and entering the specifications for, I don't know, a piece of furniture that I want, having the thing manufactured in China and shipped, and there's not even a single company involved.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, well, let's wrap things up with, I guess, a little bit of homework for everyone listening. If they did want to find out more about the Industrial Internet Consortium, where do they go?
Well, the first place to go is iiconsortium.org. Okay. So it's just the II Industrial Internet Consortium. It's a .org. Because we're a non-profit, obviously. And when you go there, you will see a set of resources. You'll see how you can become a member. You'll see the pricing structure that I mentioned, a whole bunch of other details. You can also download some of these flagship documents that I mentioned. We don't even ask you for your email address, at least not at the moment. I can ask you for your email address and then I'll get Mickey Mouse. That's okay, I don't mind. But in any event, this information is available. That's the place to start.
All right. No, that's great. And I'll put all this into show analysis notes. With that, Stephen, good talking to you again. It's been a couple years, but it was good to catch up.
Good. Thank you. Nice to talk to you too. Thanks, Bruce.
Okay. Well, that was episode 111. Obviously a great number, being a rep digit. To get analysis of this episode, links to anything that was mentioned in the show, plus the full transcript, go to show analysis notes. All of them can be found at iot-inc.com/podcasts. If you're new to this podcast, subscribe. That way you get every episode delivered straight to your device. And if you've been listening for a while, there are 4 ways you can support this podcast. First and foremost, you can leave a rating or review on iTunes. Just go to iot-inc.com/iTunes and only take you one click or maybe a little bit longer if you write down your thoughts. You can share it on your blog, personal or company. You can share it on social. And the big one, you can sponsor it directly. Your company can reach this show's listeners with an audio ad that's read on this show. There's going to be a couple of those coming up. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair. Thank you for listening. Until next time, may your path to IoT business be a group one.
You have been listening to the IoT Inc Business Show.